Welcome to the Spa Girls podcast, the self-publishing podcast for authors. You're in the right place for the best writing, marketing, and publishing advice, plus interviews with industry experts and best-selling authors. I'm Cheryl Phipps.
I'm Shah Barrett.
And I'm Trudy J. And this week we have the delightful Jennifer Hilt with us to talk about tropes.
Hey, Jen.
Hello.
Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
No worries at all. It's a delight to have you here. So I'm going to quickly read Jen's bio and then we're going to get right into our topic of tropes. I'm super excited to hear everything you have to say and dig into your knowledge, basically. So don't be scared. It'll be fine.
It won't hurt a bit.
All right. Jennifer Hilt is a USA Today bestselling author of the Trope Thesaurus, the Trope Thesaurus Horror, the Trope Thesaurus Romance, and the Trope Thesaurus Fantasy and Science Fiction. She's written 24 books across 4 pen names, plus her urban fantasy series, The Undead Detective. With degrees in linguistics and literature, Jennifer loves talking about story development. She also collects dictionaries in unfamiliar languages, binges Scandi Noir series, and shouts out tropes from the comfort of her couch. That's awesome. I'm going to start doing that every time I see a trope in a movie. You know what that is?
Oh, that's going to go down really well with your husband watching.
Yes, I do have some. My husband has had to become used to that charming little quality of mine, I guess we could say.
Don't get me started on watching Cozy Mysteries, but I'm always telling him who did it.
Are you right? Are you always right?
A lot of the time,
Yeah.
or at least they're the red herring, and I pick that up,
Yeah.
so
Yeah. Funny. And I like the idea of dictionaries in unfamiliar languages. Like, where do you find dictionaries in other languages? Like, are they just in secondhand stores or when you travel?
Yeah.
Libraries.
I don't know how it is in New Zealand, but in the US, we have a very robust secondhand stores, like they're called Goodwill, and they're just like people donate things they don't want. And they're actually better than like if I go to a regular secondhand bookstore, because you can just find like the most kind of obscure, bizarre things. It's just truly delightful. So I'm always hunting around for something else.
Oh, that's fun. Okay, that's awesome. All right, well, let's get actually started on the interview now that I've satisfied my curiosity about your bio. So Jennifer, tell us about how you got into writing and self-publishing. Tell us your origin story.
Sure. I've been writing for probably 25 years. I started obviously when I was a lot younger, and for a long time, I really wanted to be traditionally published. And so I was working on that. And then we had kids, and that was kind of, we had kids, which is always a kind of a derailment in some ways. But then they ended up having some health issues. So that kind of made things a lot harder. And I also at that time, though, realized, I needed to really get serious because I was never going to have more time. And so then I really kind of knuckled down and started like really thinking about like craft in different ways, and really I've always been interested in how stories are put together. So I started self-publishing I think about 10 years ago, because it was 2015, so I think it was around 2015 or 2014. And I did a whole bunch of self-publishing different kinds of romance genres during that time, and I had this well, definitely you would say it's a weakness in the market of that. I write 5 books in a genre and then I'm like done with that genre, because it's like the last thing you're supposed to do is like do that. And I read this. I love to read books by authors about writing. And so Norman Mailer, who I feel safe in saying is like somebody who I would never personally like or want to have like dinner with or anything, this American author, he did write a book about writing that I really liked. And he said in there, you need to find a way to turn your strength into your weakness. And I'm like, well, that's a lot of, how's that going to help me? So it was really funny that eventually I kind of was able to do that when I went to write the Trope Thesaurus, because I was always interested in what was happening in other genres, even when I was working in a particular genre. So I kept reading pretty widely and studying things in other genres. So I published in romance, and did like these 5 different pen names under different romance subgenres, thinking I was going to find my thing and not get sick of everything after 5 books. And I was helping teaching writing and plotting to other romance authors. And when I was doing it, I noticed I really like doing that, by the way. But I noticed when I was doing it, we needed like a common storytelling language because we would be talking about things and I'd be like, oh, okay, so you're talking about like this is like best friend's little sister, or this is like, like revenge or something like that. And it was interesting. This was in the pandemic time that the response I got from authors at that time was, oh, that sounds like a trope, and I wanted to write a good story. And so that was really
Oh.
interesting to me as like an as like person who's very curious about language, because I was like, well, we need like these storytelling, we need like a common language to talk about story, but then why do we have these feelings about that? And so then that kind of started my whole journey of, and of course it was the pandemic, so I was like, I had lots of time to like read stuff, and I've watched lots of Netflix and bore my family with talking about all these things. And that was when I really started to realize, oh, that tropes aren't just something that we maybe see in, if you're old enough to remember something like soap operas like Dallas or Dynasty or those kind of things. Like my favorite authors, like Tana French, who is like, I think a genius, is like, her stuff had like tons of tropes in it when I went and read it, but it was just kind of how she used them, but they were definitely in there. And so that then made me realize, oh, it's not that tropes are a problem. It's just how we use them, but we need this like common storytelling language. I also don't know if you guys have heard, are you familiar with David Sedaris? He's like an American
Yeah.
shorts. Yeah. And he was always somebody that I was always really curious about with his stories. That he uses so much everyday language in them, but yet he also has all these like creative twists. And I was always trying to figure out like, how is he able to do this, And then it was like when I was like really understanding tropes more, I'm like, oh, that's how he's doing it. So I wrote this book, The Trope Thesaurus, which took me a couple years because I like really wasn't sure what I was doing, and I had to do a lot of research. And it was at the time that we weren't talking about tropes like we were now. So when I put it up, that was the only book about tropes on Amazon. Theodora Taylor's book about universal fantasy, we know each other, but we hadn't been talking. So it was kind of interesting. Her book came out about 4 months before mine, where she talks about things related to tropes and tropes in kind of a different way. So it was just kind of interesting that we were both kind of working in these parallel play kind of ways. But when I put it up for pre-order, it was like, oh, immediately I started to get pre-orders for it, which I was like, oh, that's cool. Because I was like, this could be like a complete crash and burn. Nobody could be, So that was just really interesting and I put everything I had into that first book because I was like, well, this is probably going to be the only time I do this. And so I wasn't really expecting to do others or for it to turn into like a thing that took a lot of my time and energy. I just kind of thought it was like a one-off thing. But the thing that kind of helped me while I was doing that, it was like, if you're around, I think for long enough, sometimes you can be in the right place at the right time, was that there was also like a surge of interest in tropes in the writing world because of TikTok. I think, and then also you'd see Netflix, they'd be like, oh, if you like these tropes, check out these movies. And so I feel like in the writing world, we were more ready to talk about tropes than perhaps we had been before. So that's kind of, and now I'm just working on my mystery thriller Trope Thesaurus book that's going to come out this year, and then I'm going to do one about memoirs, and then I'm probably going to be done. So so that's kind of how I got to where
Famous last words though, Jennifer. Be careful putting that one out.
Well, I don't know. Is that 5 books in that series?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. See, I think yeah. If I do memoir, that might be 6. So this would be my longest series.
Oh, maybe you work that out.
Yes. That's so funny. I hadn't thought about that before, but that's really funny though. But yes.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That's fascinating. And I've got 2 things. You said strength into a weakness, and I just want to make sure, did you mean weakness into a strength about your
weakness? Yeah, he said
use a weakness and turn it into a strength?
Yeah, I'm sorry. He said, yeah, try to find a way to turn your weakness into a strength.
Yeah, okay.
That's what I meant to say.
Yeah, that's all right. Because I was just wondering if there was something that I didn't get around that, so it's fine. It just was around the wrong way. And then, so that's fascinating, and your journey into it is quite interesting. Even the mention of TikTok I love, because actually I think TikTok has made readers much more aware of tropes as well. Like we would never have, as authors 10 years ago, have been talking about the tropes that we had in books. People might know that they liked an amnesiac story or a secret baby or whatever, but they wouldn't necessarily be talking about it. Whereas these days we do, definitely, as readers and as authors. So it's fascinating.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think is interesting is even like titling and naming, like, it used to be if you put a trope title in the name of your book about 15 years ago, I'd say it was almost like, okay, um, that was like, especially before indie publishing, that was like usually a Harlequin, one of those very small press books. It was like not very prestigious, it was kind of like, oh, people really look down on it. And now it's just so fascinating because I see it in every genre. They will list tropes like, say like, oh, the silent moon or something, and then it'll say like, and list like 3 tropes story in it. And that's just really interesting to me.
Once again, can I just say romance leads
Sure.
the way, which is so common. Like always, romance writers have been, absolutely nailing it from decades and decades and decades ago and actually starting the trends. But you're right, because it was associated with Harlequin and often the use of the trope in the title, whether it was the Greek billionaire's illegitimate
Right.
wife or
Secret
whatever.
baby or something.
Yeah, that's the one. The wife doesn't have to be illegitimate. But and then it was often assigned formulaic because of that association with the actual trope being talked about.
And then everybody cringed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's
so,
and
but
it's
then
like
everyone
totally
read
different
it.
now.
It was obviously
Of
based on
course they
something,
did.
right? Because you would know, oh, I love a secret baby story. I'll read that one.
Yeah.
And I love me a Greek billionaire, so I'll go read. Like it worked. So that's why they did
I think
it. They
those were
weren't
even like
silly.
early subscription services where there'd be like 4 books a month and you would get those mailed to you.
Yep.
And so,
I remember those
it's just
days.
really
Oh, I
interesting.
used to love getting that little package in the mail.
Yeah. So it's interesting how those things kind of change.
Well, I feel like that it's no longer the sort of what's the word? Tropes now, it's cool to be talked about, whereas before it was kind of like, ooh, you don't want to be associated with using that kind of language to describe your book because it puts you in some kind of,
A
pigeonhole.
formulaic kind of situation where
That's
you're
kind of
writing.
like, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's all. I had it. You go.
I was just going to say that was kind of like probably the closest thing I feel like I kind of have to a calling is to kind of like take the shame away from the idea of tropes because I don't think that we need that. I think tropes are just, I feel like tropes are just a story building block and they express a relationship and you can do whatever you want with that idea, but it gives us a common language. So like instead of having to, you say, oh, well, this person doesn't have parents, they don't have a society, and they blah, 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 blah. You're like, oh, an orphan.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, it's an orphan. We're going to take an orphan and we're going to put them on a journey with a whole bunch of other stuff, and we get all these other things happen to them. But it was like, I think that's the biggest thing I feel like is I don't think tropes are a thing that we need to be ashamed of. They're just an idea, and you can develop that how you want. But it's just a I refer to them as like a neutral idea, that it doesn't necessarily have like positive or negative connotations to it. And I distinguish it between cliches or stereotypes because I feel like those actually do have a lot of shame attached to them. The examples I tend to think of are like dumb jock or gold digger or things that reflect about, and like really derogatory, like things you wouldn't want to call your mother or your friend or something like that. And you can take like those qualities of like, I think of like, oh, like a dumb jock. You could take an athlete who has like some learning disabilities and still write a story about that. But you have all these other parts of the characters you can develop. It doesn't have to be like diminishing in that way. So that's kind of like, I guess if I was going to have a hill, that I'm going to die on, that's it.
Yeah.
So let's go back to the beginning. Let's start.
Oh, sure.
So how do you define a trope? Like, what is a trope? If we're gonna,
So for me, I think of it as a neutral story building block. Like I said, it has it doesn't have a positive or negative connotation. It's just kind of like this general idea that's easily understood by pretty much, readers. Anybody, I think of it as like in the US, anybody over a 6th grade education, they get what most tropes are. And but I also think that the power to them is that they signify relationships in some way. So like, yes, something like enemies to lovers, that's clearly talking about a relationship. But if I go back to like My Beloved Orphan, there's lots of relationships that are going to involve that orphan in terms of like the journey that they take, where they came from, all those kind of things. So there's gonna be like things that we add to that that original trope of orphan. So I think of it as the neutral building block. I think of it as the relationship, and I also think of them as really sources of conflict for characters and story, because with tropes, like, things happen. And then the other thing, like the kind of fourth thing that I think about them is like, that's a promise to the reader. Like when I open a story and I see that there are some tropes like referred to, I'm like, oh, thank God. Like, we're not going to be just kind of like sitting around and, talking about brushing our teeth or looking in the mirror or something like that. Things are going to happen. There's a plan, So those are kind of like what I think about when I think about tropes.
Are they ones that need to be universally understood? Is that a part of it too? Like,
yes, that's what I think is pretty much their superpower.
Yeah.
Is that they're pretty much universally understood. There's a few that like so the idea of I refer to it as like forced proximity, and like readers would think, oh, it's like the one bad, or you're stuck in the house with the serial killer, or like it's that same idea of your. But most of the time, I think like the words themselves are just very easily understood to the people reading or watching the story. So that's kind of like why I think they've been around forever and why they have such power.
Yeah. So is it because the other thing I would think, so it's with tropes, is that they've been almost, it's a story section that's been repeated so many times we kind of understand it. And it used to be readers understood it without even having to be told it. And now, as discussed, we're kind of like being told it a little bit more, or what to expect. So that promise to the reader, I think, is quite an important part of it too, isn't it? Like if you say that it's a secret baby book and then you don't provide a secret baby,
it's a problem. Yeah.
Or an enemies to lovers where they're not enemies, they're friends. I mean, oh God, I would hate that. I would be so annoyed.
And I think it's And I think it's really important, because I think sometimes people think like, if you're especially a newer writer, everybody and their brother is writing an enemies to lovers romantasy. I need to do that. But you don't need to do that. But what you really don't need to do is say that that's what it is, but it's something else, and not have that in there, like you're saying, because people then, it makes them crazy because they're looking for it. Like, so for example, just myself, I love twin stories. And what I love about twin stories is kind of, to me, there's like an inherent promise in there that they're going to swap identities. It's probably from reading those Sweet Valley High books as a kid, years and years ago. Yeah. And so I'm like, oh, there better be a scene in here where they do that. And so if you have a book that has twins and they don't swap identities, unless if they're identical twins, there better be a really good reason, because that's part of why I'm reading it, is for that like journey of, oh, there's a misunderstanding, there's going to be misunderstandings and other things happen and all that kind of stuff. And I feel like our readers or audiences are very instinctively savvy to those relationships and tropes. And so they will notice if you don't carry through with it.
Yeah.
So to me, it's almost like the trope is kind of the cake, and they're describing the type of cake, and then the expectations that readers have about the execution of that trope are the actual ingredients in that cake, right? So it's like, if you forget the cake, actually, no, it's the ingredients of the trope. So you've got to deliver those. It's not just enough to say that. So yes, there's a secret baby, but there's also even more to it. For example, in the enemies to lovers, you want to see the scenes where they're clashing, kind of thing.
And then the scene where they kind of get together, but they kind of still don't like each other, and all those kinds of things.
You have to show all that stuff. You can't just like skip from like enemies to the end, and we all feel cheated.
And the worst
but you
kind
bring
of
up
one,
a really good point.
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
I was going to say the worst kind of one is where it says it's enemies to lovers and they're enemies, and then suddenly they're lovers, and there's no kind of journey from how they got there.
Right.
That's
right.
Drives me nuts. Anyway, sorry, keep going.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, that's true. You want to we want to have that like vicarious experience with them. I was going to say, yeah, the point that you're bringing up is also part of actually how I view tropes is that I kind of think of them as like this little triangle, or I kind of think about tropes as like tropes, genre, expectations, and then the third corner I think of as goal, motivation, and conflict. And I kind of feel like this little triangle, like I kind of bounce around all the corners of it when I'm working on something. I'm making sure, like, kind of moving back and forth to make sure, because I think you're right. I think that the genre expectations are super important with tropes, and they have to you have to have that because, like, with romance or mystery or any of them, there you need it. That's what we're using this general idea, but then we need to have it work for what our audience is expecting.
So is that how we would start to make tropes work for us? So if we took, for example, enemies to lovers, do you then go, okay, what are the beat points that every enemies to lovers book has to have if you're going to use that as your trope? Is it breaking down that much, or is that too much?
You can use them in different ways. So, like, and people view this differently. I'll just give you my version of it. So if you were, so let's say, for example, I'm thinking of Pride and Prejudice, but because a lot of people are probably familiar with that. But if you aren't familiar with that, then you're probably familiar with Bridget Jones' Diary, like, because that's basically the same story, just in a different setting. But if you think of how all those various scenes of how she goes on that journey, when she meets our hottie Darcy, to like, and they have an initial like dislike to the end. Those are all like very major scenes in it. So I would think of that as using the enemies to lover trope in a very as like a major story arc. But I think that tropes can also be minor story arcs. So you could have like a side character who has tropes also and have those kind of relationships. So I think it just depends. I'm always trying to think of like, okay, are these like major or second, like kind of primary or secondary storylines? But I think the beauty of the tropes is you can use them for either. And you can use them for other characters too. It's not just our main characters. So, but then when you do choose it for like something like that, like Pride and Prejudice or Bridget Jones' Diary, something like that, then yes, you do need to break down all those scenes. And that's how you get, readers really getting that emotional experience. I mean, can you imagine if you didn't have some of like the scene where like the two guys are fist fighting in the first movie was like so great, and just kind of like, oh, if you didn't have that in Bridget Jones' Diary where he kind of is, they're kind of fighting over Bridget, you would be like, oh, like kind of cheated if she just winds up with back with the jerky guy, who's also quite hot, but yeah.
So
yeah, I think the thing with tropes is it's like lots of layers of how you use them.
Yeah, and I definitely think that there's an expectation from the reader that you have to take into account, right? Like that you can't just ignore what a reader who knows that genre is expecting from you, which is why as an author, if you're trying to use tropes, I would suggest that you would probably go and read a lot of books that use the trope that you're considering using, so that you can kind of see how it's being used. Yeah. Another really to signify relationships in some way is a really interesting thing, and I'd never thought about that in terms of tropes. So if we thought of all the tropes, is it always going to be signifying a relationship? I can't think of any off the top of my head that don't, but
for me, that's how I think about them. That it's either like something with that like a character up, something that's going to define that it could be used to define a character, like some part of their journey individually, or something that could be like specifically between, two or more people if you're doing like a why choose kind of thing. But that for me, I feel like that's why they keep hanging around. And in my book, I refer to this. I love Save the Cat by Blake Snyder. It's a book that's been around for a really long time. And I read that book quite a long time ago, and there was this quote in there that I often refer to where a movie executive was saying to him, Blake Snyder, who was a screenwriter, said, "Give me the same thing, only different." And for like the longest time, I was always like, what's the thing? If I knew what the thing was, then I would be like, oh, And so then when I was doing this work with tropes, I was like, oh, that's it. That's the thing. Because it's like, I could all of a sudden see things of like, especially I think movie titles, like I thought of 40-Year-Old Virgin. I'm Like, I would not have thought that you could take the virgin trope and do something in our modern era that would be a new, something different with it, but yet still resonate with people. But it did. It was like that was about this man's emotional journey, not just like a sexual, kind of series of events. And so it was like, I think the movies have been onto it maybe longer than as writers about different ways that you can use them to show that.
And that's another way, like you talked earlier about how a writer had said, I don't want to use tropes because I want to write a good book. Which is stab to the heart. But
I know.
But that's actually like a good way to think of it is, using the trope, but finding your own way to use that trope.
Absolutely.
Like delivering those moments that the reader is after, but doing it in your way, like as you as a reader. So you can.
I kind of think of them as kind of like hooks, or like, I'm not like a rock climber or anything like that, but almost as like a way to find your footing in the story. And then once a reader knows, okay, this is about this, then you like make it very much your own. But I love to read fantasy, and when I'm confronted with like a book that has like, it's like a page of dense text and it's all this like world building and names with lots of consonants and all this kind of stuff, I'm like, it just makes my eyes glaze over, because I'm like, I don't even know like how to find my way into this. But if you were like, show me a predicament with somebody who has a problem that they're trying to solve, and then you gradually feed me all these other cool things about how the world works and the magic and all these things, then I'm on board for that, because I'm like, oh, okay, we're on this like cool journey. But I think that's the thing that is really helpful about tropes, is that it can kind of give you this like foothold. And then yes, you totally want to show, like, you don't want to just like drop a whole bunch of tropes in and then like assume the reader is going to figure it all out.
And I think it's important to know who your reader is as well, because some tropes are more applicable to different age groups, demographics is huge, I think. And we're talking about something like the 40-year-old virgin, but if you turn that on its head and made it a woman instead, a younger age group would be like, how is that even possible? But as you get older, you realize that actually this could happen if a woman is like, not trapped, but, she's got all these other responsibilities and she doesn't have time for herself, that this could happen later in life. And I think, just tapping into who you think your reader is by reading other books, it's a good way to find out what your tropes should be.
But do you feel like the 40-year-old virgin, if it was a woman, would be like a woman's fiction story rather than a comedy story?
Potentially,
do you know what I mean?
yes.
Like it's the juxtaposition there, so it changes, but it's the same trope, and it just changes depending on who you do it and who it is and how they work it. So you mentioned that you like, we talked about Bridget Jones's Diary and Pride and Prejudice. So do you think that tropes are different from movie to book? Like, are they the same tropes just in visual form, or is it a very different thing?
I honestly view them as all pretty much the same thing. It's just kind of how they're applied. And I also feel like, even though I've written books that have different genres, I talk about the same tropes. For me, there's not like a different you don't need to learn one set of tropes for romance and one set of tropes for mystery. No, it's like they're the same tropes, but it's just how the genre expectations work with it that gives you the different kind of flavors, I guess we would say. So I think that for me, I find that there's probably like 40 to 50 that is how I view it. The reason why people will say, oh, they just want like the definitive list is because there's, people view it different ways. Like, for example, secrets, you can just think of that as a general category, or you can have like secret baby, or the hidden, the orphan, the orphan who's the chosen one, and different things like that. So there's different numbers of them, but I just like the idea. I like the idea that tropes are almost also like paints that you could use to tell your story, and you just pick what you want to use, and you can and mix them together in different ways. So it's not like you're starting with maybe a red, but then you're going to add some other stuff to it, and maybe it's going to like veer off towards a purple or something like that, or an orange. But that's the kind of thing that I think it's why they're so powerful is because they're constant around, and that the ones that we're talking about have this constancy, and we don't have to keep explaining and reinventing to the readers about what they are. So I think they're just used differently in they can be definitely used differently in visual storytelling because you're able to kind of like cover ground more quickly, I think. But I think that you're also seeing, I don't see them as being different in that way.
Yeah. Now you mentioned there, sorry, the secrets versus secret baby, and that's, to me, secrets is a very wide, general trope, and secret baby and secret something, like whatever, secret inheritance, they're very specific. Are they both still tropes, or are they kind of like it's almost like there's layers to it? It's like the wider layer, and then you can go deeper. Is that?
Yes, I think that's true. And the like linguist part of me loves the like there's all these layers. But I think that, yes, there's like secrets, and then so I guess to answer your question, I think of it kind of as both ways, depending on what works for the person. I don't want people to feel like, oh, I'm not sure I can get this classification right, therefore I can't use it. It's like, use what works for your story, use that. It's a common idea. Use however you need to use that idea. Don't be afraid to kind of get messy and bend them, because that's what they're there for. But I like tropes as like this kind of big kind of overarching idea, like you said. But then I like underneath it, you can have other specific kind of secrets depending on what your story is. It just kind of depends what you're trying to do. I love a good secret baby because I tend to think of them not just how we often see them with romance, but I tend to think of them how we often see them in mystery, of like somebody turns out to be the secret baby of so-and-so 20 years ago. And we didn't know that and it's again, this relationship happened. And so they're the person who's going to inherit everything. And did they kill this other person or whatever, something like that. But now that I read mysteries, when I read mysteries, I'm always like, oh, there's going to be a secret baby in here somewhere. I just know.
To be fair, that everybody that does Ancestry.com finds a secret baby in their family tree. So it's probably something all of us have got now.
Oh, that's great. That's really great. I hadn't thought about that. That's really great.
Yeah, that's funny. So I like the idea of that there's smaller detailed tropes versus the wider, bigger ones. And I also think that maybe like it's almost, do you think it's better to dig down a bit and have is secrets ever a kind of a good trope to use, or are you better to try and go what kind of secret and dig into that trope more?
I think it depends on the kind of story you're doing. I mean, I love so with this, I'm doing a lot of looking at mysteries and thrillers now, and I just feel like secrets and scars are like just such the kind of bread and butter of storytelling. I just love them so much. And I've been kind of like trying to figure out why they're so good. And one of the things I was kind of coming to the realization is there's a lot of the emotion, like, because a lot of what we're talking about tropes is like they're helping us tap into an emotion for the reader, shame. And that's like this universal, really, really powerful human emotion that we all have. And there's secrets and scars can be like a really great carrier for that, so that you can have your characters like wrestling with that in this way, using a secret or a scar that they might not be like aware of. Like we're planning it for their character, and they're struggling with something, but they're not necessarily conscious of it. Like, they're like going to the therapist and all this kind of stuff. It's like their life is they're having a really tough time. They keep making these mistakes, blah, 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 blah. And so I think that's really kind of neat that the tropes can help us like tap into these very universal human emotions. And especially something like, I just find the shame really interesting because I had done some research, and it's like one of the most difficult human emotions to overcome, which was fascinating to me to learn that. And I'm like, oh, that's why so many stories have that. Or like really good stories, everybody's got a secret in there, or everybody's got some kind of scar. And so then I'm like, oh, that totally makes sense, because we all kind of are like that, right? We don't show it, but it's just so it's kind of neat, I think, to think about like that. But yes, I think like you can start, like when I'm starting a book, I don't know all these things, and most people don't know all these little things. You have like some ideas about stuff, but like the more you go into it, the more layers, the more detailed you get. Then you're like, oh, I knew they had something that was bothering them. Now I know it's this thing, so then you can get more specific, like you say, and kind of more granular.
And it's like as the story goes along, you can almost have it as a revelation that not only did you think as the main character that this person had an issue, they didn't actually realize it themselves. They were just a certain way and they didn't understand it, but things triggered them. And then suddenly there's this revelation, they have a big argument or whatever, and it comes out, and then they're astounded as well. And I love that. I think that is actually applicable in things like cozy mysteries or urban fantasy, where, there is some dark secret that they themselves are not aware of, and scars and all that sort of thing. And that makes for a well-rounded character, all those other things.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, because I think we're trying to create characters that are like ourselves, is like real people, but like, kind of less the boring bits of having to pay bills or, do those kind of things, but like still like feel like, oh, that's a person. Like I mentioned, Tana French, she writes these really great psychological mystery kind of thrillers. I would say she sort of straddles several genres. I still feel like if I went to Ireland, I could go to that office, walk, get in there somehow. I don't know how because I don't have a badge, but I could go and all those detectives would be in that room and I could just sit there and watch them all at work. They're so real to me,
Yeah.
And that's kind of like, I think, what our goal is to inspire that kind of fervor in our story, in our lives.
And I like what you said before. You said it's all tapping into an emotion. And I think that's what we have to remember about tropes. They might be kind of nice and neatly packaged up as enemies to lovers or secret baby. And you kind of know the way to do that perhaps, but what you've got to remember is it's about emotion, and it's not the emotion of the character, it's the emotion that the reader is experiencing as they read this, that you have to remember about. So how do we ensure that we do that as we're using a trope in one of our novels? Like, how do we make sure that we are evoking the emotion that we're trying to evoke?
Right. Well, I think it just depends on like, I'm a really big fan of goal, motivation, and conflict. And so like really thinking about like what it is your character wants, and how you're going to make it really difficult for them to get it. And usually as I toggle back between goal and conflict, that's when I kind of find what the emotion is. But like it occurs to me that like more and more that a lot of what enemies to lovers is about forgiveness and accept, obviously kind of acceptance at the end of your the character's faults and flaws and the other person's, and that you're kind of able to like accept, equalize, make kind of come to an equilibrium together. So I think it's just kind of thinking about like what is the emotion that you're going for behind the journey that your characters make, and that we use tropes to like help us figure that out. So like, for example, I think of, and some of them I just think come with an emotion, like, so found family, I really think of as like a sense of belonging, acceptance, or community. And like, so pretty much that's something we see in all different kinds of stories. It doesn't matter what genre. Ticking Time Bomb, I love because it gives us a time element for our story. We don't have forever and a day to figure out who the murderer is or for this couple to get together. But I feel like that's really helpful because it generates basically like anxiety in some way in the story that has, and so just kind of tapping into those very common human emotions are things I think are really like kind of the thing of the tropes that we don't talk about a lot, but what we're trying to get to.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So if we're talking Pride and Prejudice, what are the tropes in Pride and Prejudice? Let's assume that everyone knows.
Sure. Yeah. So I would say I'm just gonna I have a list over here of all of them, and I have it alphabetical, even though I don't love that, but that's just easiest. But if I think about going through it, I think about across the tracks, because in terms of Darcy's standing is so much higher than Elizabeth. So it's like they're kind of from unequal. They're both gentry people, but the whole part of the story is that they're not exactly on the same standing. Let's see. I would say antagonist is definitely Mr. Darcy. Or I mean, not Mr. Darcy, Wickham, but there's also other characters that could be antagonists depending on your viewpoint, like her wonderful cousin, who's going to inherit their house that the mother tries to get her to marry, Mr. Collins. Oh, how could I forget Mr. Collins? I think there's Darcy's kind of the whole billionaire and also kind of royalty element of it in there. There's definitely hidden identity because we don't know about the Wickham doesn't present as we find out who he is later. Um, let's see. I think there's some, I'm trying to think of why I thought fake relationship. I think there's a point where he's kind of wooing Elizabeth, but he's thinking of he's got his eye on her younger sister. So I was maybe thinking about that. Found family is kind of I think how they in the end all the sisters find their or at least Jane and Elizabeth find their spouse. Definitely kind of I think that Darcy and Elizabeth have the enemies to lovers. Fish out of water, I think of when Elizabeth walked to Darcy's house and she was kind of like in this grand manner when Jane was ill and she's kind of trying to, take care of her sister and yet hold her own against the other people there. Of course, proximity is like definitely because they're all in that community and
when her sister is ill
in that little town. Sorry?
When their sister is ill, that she's forced to stay there and interact with them.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. So there's lots of them. So there's not just
there's
like
lots of them. Oh, so I'm sorry. I should tell you, yes, that when I get started, I can find a lot. The thing is like it's not like every trope is used in every scene. They can be used in like little bits of scenes or like I said, like a big thing. So when you start looking for them, you can see them used in different ways like that. So
Do you have to have a major trope?
I do. I think you do, because I think that kind of helps. Like for that one, I do think it's enemies to lovers because they just started out so set against each other. But I do think that there's usually tropes that help you hold the whole stories together. Like for fantasy, a lot we see like journey or quest is a big trope. For mystery, a lot we see like MacGuffin if you're searching for this like object. So those are kind of tropes that we'll see that like propel the whole story too.
Yeah, I feel like you'd have to have, but it's interesting that you're talking about there being a trope for a scene. Like that's quite cool too. So there's all these different ways there's the big tropes and the layers of the tropes, and then there's the overarching trope, and then there's the trope for a scene. And I imagine when Jane Austen was writing this book, she didn't sit down and go, okay, what are the tropes that I'm going to put in this book?
No.
She just probably, I mean, who knows, but wrote the things that she thought people would like to read about, or even that she would like to read about, maybe. And it just goes to show we're kind of instinctive when we are writing, perhaps. But so why is it important, do you think, that we actually have become a little bit less instinctual and a little bit more purposeful when we use these tropes in our books? And how do we?
I think it's just, I think it's just an evolution. I think, to me, tropes are like the same thing as archetypes, but nobody wants to talk about archetypes. That word just makes everybody go, where I think tropes are just like an easier word to talk about with that. I think it's probably just a way that our society is evolving. I mean, I think a lot of these tropes are pretty easy to trace back into like fairy tales. A lot of times I think about, I think like a lot of romances are some version of Beauty and the Beast. And then I see that of like one of my favorite romances is Jane Eyre. And I'm like, oh, that's like so like Beauty and the Beast, but like with these other things going on. But like, so these things, like you were saying, they existed like long time ago. They're just like human patterns of our relationships and being with each other. And they just kind of keep carried forward. But probably because of technology now, I'm thinking that we're like more conscious of them, where before we would just kind of use, because a lot of times I'll have authors say to me, well, I need to put some tropes in my story. I'm like, well, you already have tropes in there. It's just you haven't been thinking of them in that way. And that's okay if you just want to. It's helpful, I think, for marketing now, is why we keep seeing them again and again. If you're like, know what your keywords are, and you can like use them for like ads, and you can definitely use them for your blurbs, those kind of things. But I think that the idea, it's not like these ideas are really new. It's just that we're talking about them kind of in a slightly different way.
And from a reader's perspective, it helps you to choose quicker. Like there's so many books out there, whereas many years ago there weren't perhaps. And yeah, I mean, if you're looking for a certain trope, you just have to type it in, don't you? And out comes
Yeah.
all these selections, and in a particular genre, obviously. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if
Years
a
and years
writer
ago.
was starting out and they were wanting to be more trope aware, shall we say, when they're working, um, do you do the plot first and then figure out the tropes, or would you think about the tropes first and then think about a plot around that? Like, what would your advice be to them?
I would just work on telling whatever the story is that you want to tell. And then when I run into like where I run onto juice and I run like, okay, what do I need? What do I need to know more? Do I need to know more about the characters? Do I need to know more about the plot? And then I find tropes are helpful with that. Like, okay, I need more conflict. I need more tension. So let me look through these lists and think, oh, a lot of times I think tropes can be helpful in building the backstories of your characters that we don't necessarily need to tell our readers right away, but it helps with the motivation and the conflict and all those kind of things. So like who their family is and what their education was and blah, 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 all those kind of things. Tropes can be really helpful for building those kind of characters. So I don't feel like there's a specific way you have to do it. I think it's just kind of whatever way works best for you. And then again, when you kind of like run into a spot of trouble or you want to know more, that's because for me it never helps to think about like what kind of shoes they're wearing or like what's in the refrigerator. Like that works for some people, but for me it doesn't. But then I think about, well, what is their family like, and what was school like for them, or what kind of job do they have, or those kind of things. Then those help me understand more about the characters, and then I can like kind of pull in tropes for those. So the thing I would say if you feel like, oh, you aren't familiar with tropes, I think the best way to do it is honestly to just like watch some movies and look for them. And you can use like the like rom-coms are great from like the 80s and 90s. Like anything with Julia Roberts is just like couldn't be more trope heavy, right? It's like they even often have like Pretty Woman and The Runaway Bride, like in the title, or like You've Got Mail with Meg Ryan. Like if you're looking to just kind of become more familiar with tropes, if you're a newer writer, those are really helpful because you can just kind of spot them more easily. I feel like it's more difficult to spot them in our own work. And so usually you need to either hand it to a friend and say, what do you think are some of the tropes that are going on in here? Or like set it aside for a while and look at it with fresh eyes. But and the other thing I think can be helpful is to look for tropes in genres not that you're working in. So those can be also easier to spot. Like, so if you're a romance reader, look at some mysteries or thrillers and things like that, or just whatever. It doesn't matter. They're in everything. So whatever kind of story you like, you can irritate your family by doing the calling out the tropes like I do.
So if you're again that newbie author and you go, I want to, I don't know, write an enemies to lovers story, like you kind of know that already. But I'm not really too sure about the genre, the trope. How do you go about incorporating that into your novel? Like what are the building blocks there?
Right. So, like we talked about before, I would want to know like what genre I'm working in. So if it's romance, then you're going to know that I need at the end to have these characters have a happily ever after for now. Somehow that's something like neither of them gets cancer in the end, or neither of them dies or cheats or something like that. That's not a romance. That's not a romance expectation. But then I would look at the goal, motivation, and conflict for those characters. And you want to have them like, again, mentioning like the kind of idea of forced proximity. You want to have them kind of running into each other and having conflict with each other on a regular basis. So like for if you think about Pride and Prejudice, her sister wants to marry his best friend, and he does not want that. That is like the main conflict of that story, and which is great, right? Because it's like it's so well organized because it's not even just her best friend, it's her sister, it's her beloved sister, and he's quite thinks he's quite the good friend to ward him away from marrying Jane. But it's like it just increases those ties of tension because it's not even just somebody like Charlotte who's also her friend, but she has there's that extra bond. So you want to make sure that there's a reason why those two characters have something to interact with, and that thing is of value. It's not just going to be something that's easily solved, that they both want to win, quote unquote, in the end. But
Yeah.
you know,
And I imagine there's certain other tropes, like you talked about enemies to lovers, and then I imagine underneath the overarching enemies to lovers, forced proximity is probably quite a common trope to have with that, because it's a kind of way to get these two snarling cats in the room together and let the sparks fly.
Great
And
description, Trudy.
and then across the tracks, I imagine, is another one, like another kind of often identified one. It's that conflict between the enemies to lovers.
Right.
So maybe there's ways of grouping them like that as well. Or
I think I always joke about like, oh, I didn't mean to turn this into like a women's studies lecture, but I also think that like kind of at the base of all of our tropes is this idea of power and like who's got the power of, and like trying to come to some resolution of that. And if you think about tropes, a lot of them seem to have that. And so I also think of like them in the story in that way of like, oh, so what's really going on for this character? Like, what do they really, what are they, I mean, they say they want to be, like like something, they want to be like, high school president, but like, what is that really about? Well, it's really about like recognition and trying to get people to, have respect for them or things like that. So you're trying to like dig down to like the thing that they want on the surface, and then like what that the emotion is that corresponds to that. I think honestly, just reading a lot, I forgot which one of you said that, but I feel like that's really a lot of times people are like, oh, I don't really have time. Audiobooks, but like, it is part of our job as storytellers is, and to like know what's happening in our genre, and then just like helps you to just be aware, like I said, I love to read this other stuff because then it kind of like, oh, I didn't even know, I hadn't even thought you could do that, and you see it in a different way. I love, I'm always looking for unusual applications of the amnesia trope, because I always thought of it as like what we had seen kind of growing up as like the bonk on the head in like a romance or something like that. But there's like all these really cool things that are happening in stories with amnesia now that people do these. And it's really, when you think about it, playing with memory and identity again are like these core human concepts. And so I always am like looking for other stories that do that, and this I can be impressed and things.
I love how you're describing that, actually, because when I have thought of tropes in the past, I have kind of thought of them as a little bit dry, or like a little bit like enemies to lovers. Here's the gist.
Kind of
Here's
cookie cutter kind of thing.
Yeah, like
right.
maybe. And but I love them and I use them. It's not in a derogatory way. I was just like, this is enemies to lovers, and this is what you need to incorporate to make sure that you're hitting all those notes or whatever, and that the reader will enjoy it. But actually what you're saying here is to look at the trope and then dig down into that and work out what the emotions are underneath it. So if you take, for example, an orphan, you kind of go, okay, well, you kind of know that orphan is maybe going to be feeling a lack of family and community, and maybe that's something they're going to either look for, or otherwise they're going to protect themselves and shun it. And so you've got immediately two storylines that you can then pursue, and probably more. And that goes down, and that's the core wound of that person, is maybe always being alone or something, so immediately you get the core wound, you get the emotions and how they're feeling. And it's just from that one little trope. So it's maybe if you're new to tropes and using them in your stories, a first step could be to sit down with the tropes that maybe you like the best or want to use, and kind of work out the emotions behind them and what they would be, maybe, and how it would make people feel, why people would like, why do I love enemies to lovers? I can't even tell you. I think I just love the tension,
exactly.
That's what I want out of it. So it's interesting. And I hate friends to lovers because it feels like there's no tension. But people love friends to lovers, right?
So there is tension in friends to lovers, because it's almost forbidden, because you're crossing the line from friend to lover. So it's almost a forbidden.
And if you admit it, you could lose everything.
I guess so.
Exactly. Big stakes.
And you guys are and you guys are kind of talking about like how they end up stacking together. you know, or like working to, like, I think of them as, oh, play as well with others. Cause yeah, there is that, you know, that aspect of, but I think it's great that people, you know, we're lucky that there's like these instinctive, that people have these instinctive, oh, I really like this or I don't like that, because it keeps everything from being too similar. But there's so many different ways. I mean, you think of like, you know, orphan, like it's used all over, but it's used to there's so many different ways that it's used. Because you're just, like you said, you're taking this very vulnerable being and setting it on a journey, and then there's all these different things that are going to happen to it, and so that's why we keep seeing it again and again, because it sets up that you know, setting, I guess. So but yeah,
so it does come back to emotion still, which is, I think, what we trade in as authors, is emotion and connection and storytelling is all part of that. And so the other thing I wanted to ask about is, are tropes constantly changing? Are there new ones coming on board all the time, or are they something that's kind of so ingrained, there's like a storytelling set?
I feel like in general, a lot of them are very ingrained, and like we have them like kind of referred to as evergreen. So like the ones like the 40 that I kind of mentioned that we keep mentioning are ones that are pretty standard, and we kind of like talked about this over the weekend too. But then there's like some that of there's some that I kind of think that are interesting in terms of like that we don't even use a whole lot anymore. It's something of like sex worker with a heart of gold is like a really old trope, right? And the last time I can think of that kind of being used would be like Pretty Woman in a big universal, everybody's familiar with that trope kind of way. So I think that some come out of favor more than others, or like mail order bride. Like sometimes you see those being used now in sci-fi. So in terms of like, you know, just characters that maybe are, you know, not human all the way or something like that, or but I think in general, we're talking about very common human emotions and relationships that haven't changed over time, and that's why they stay that way. So like when we look back at stuff like Jane Eyre and you know, and Jane Austen stories and things like that, that's like, oh, it's still, and even like when we think of like fairy tales from like the Grimms that are like on the dark side and stuff like that, they're still tapping into like things that are known human conditions. So
so they've always been there, we're just naming them better and using them in our writing. Okay.
I think so. That's how I view them. Yes. And a lot of people like don't like, I run Facebook ads, and oh my gosh, like it's just so funny, like the amount of it's always this older guy who tells me, you don't know anything about tropes and you should go read. I love it when they tell me like, you should go read like classic literature. And I'm like, guess what, buddy? It's got tropes in it, you know? So it's just kind of funny, you know, but people have very strong feelings about them. And so I was kind of like, well, let's just like move aside from the feelings and just talk about the idea. And then we can go back to some other things about the feelings, but I don't know.
Yeah. No, that's cool. So I think we're coming towards the end of our interview now, but I just want one last question. What's your best advice for someone who's just starting out? They've never used a trope before in their life, on purpose anyway. How do they, you know, what's the piece of advice that you would give them to how to start?
Well, first of all, I think if you're just starting out, that you should write the story you want to write and not be like, oh, I need to have these tropes in it, and I'm trying to do, just like write the story that you want to read, that you can't find. And then after you've done that, you can decide whether you want to like revise it, move on to something else. But I really feel like if there's this like burning story that you have to tell, that's really important to honor that. And then you can look for like these things that we're talking about. So I think sometimes it's easy to get very discouraged when you're just starting out, because there's like, oh, you should do it this way or this way or this way. Really, the only thing to remember is to keep going, and however that works for you. And that you don't really have to do it any particular way that people say. You just have to like keep putting words on a page and moving towards a conclusion with your story. So that's kind of like, I think the biggest thing, because I remember when I first started, that I'm not the type of writer who starts at the beginning and goes to the end. And for the longest time, I was like, well, I'm obviously not a real writer because that's not how I work. And then I love British author, mystery author Kate Atkinson. And I went and heard her once, and she talked about, she writes these, writes these small version, and then she keeps expanding it. And that's how she writes her stories. Like, that's how I write. I thought there was something wrong with me all along. And it was just kind of like, it doesn't really matter. So I think that's kind of the nice thing about like now with technology, where we have all these, like, we can do things like this where we talk about it, like where before you just have to like read a book and you were more isolated. And now it's like there's other people you can talk to and things you can learn from and like support you can get and things like that. So that's why I just feel like, the important thing is not giving up. And even when you've written lots of books, we all face like starting a new story, the same struggles, so it's just part of our job. Our job description.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much for that. Now, you mentioned earlier that you'd been talking about tropes over the weekend, and that is because you've just come off a conference about tropes. So can you tell us about that quickly and talk about how people can get access to that?
Sure. So because I like to talk about tropes so much, and I was like, what would happen if I just had like a trope con? And I just asked all these like smart people I knew, because I was like, well, I know what I think about tropes, but what if I asked these other people, and they came in and I just talked to them and we had these conversations and things. And so I had no idea if anybody was interested again in it. And it was, that is how TropeCon was born. Also, I wanted to have something that was like, I feel like there are a lot of resources for newer writers starting out. And sometimes when like you've written some books, but you want to like go further, it's harder to find kind of intermediate or mid-career things. So I was looking to have conversations with writers who've like been doing this for quite a while. So I had this virtual TropeCon, and you can find out about it on my website. It's just jenniferhilt.com. But I'm trying to remember now, I think I had 12 author interviews with various authors about tropes in different genres or from different perspectives. And then I did 2 live Q&As and then a 1 live session with Nat Connors of Kindle Trends and Quinn Ward, where we just kind of talked about, because people always are curious, like with tropes and trends, how that works, like kind of our thoughts on that. And it was just a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed doing it. And just was kind of neat to see something that people were like, they could learn about tropes in different genres.
What did you call it, like Jen?
I'm sorry?
What did you call it?
TropeCon?
TropeCon.
I just called it 2025 TropeCon.
Right.
Yeah. So and it was my first time doing a virtual conference, so that was interesting.
Always a learning curve.
Yes, exactly. Yes,
and that's still available. So all those videos are there. Yes, if someone wanted to
if you go to my website, you can still find it. And the materials are all recorded, even the live things, and it's good for a year. Like you can go back and access things and all that till in 2026 in April.
Awesome.
So so much technical. The content part I loved, and interviewing the other authors was super fantastic. It was like, struggling with Teachable. That's like, things like that. It's always like,
the joy of technology. Yes.
Yes, exactly.
Also, and if anyone wants to purchase, you've got, what did we say? Four books, different books on the different tropes. Different genres.
4 books now. Yep.
So
and
far.
I have a romance workbook that's through my website, but you can find it through that. But the books are all available wide, so you can find them at any kind of retailer you like. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us here today in the Spa. It's been
so
really fascinating to talk about tropes and how you can use them. So I really appreciated that. And so if someone wants to find you, the best place to find you is via the website?
Yep. jenniferhilt.com.
Awesome. Perfect.
Yeah.
And
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, we can be found at spargirlspodcast.com, and you can find all the goodies on our Patreon at patreon.com/spargirlspodcast.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jennifer. It's been a pleasure to have you. And thank you to all of our listeners who have been with us here.
Thank you, guys.
Another episode. And we'll see you all next week with another episode of the Spa Girls podcast. Farewell.
Bye.
Well, bye.
Bye.